3 Roman cities, burned to ash in 70 days by one queen who Rome swore could never lead an army. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a woman with a whip-scarred back and 2 broken daughters raised an army of tens of thousands, brought the mightiest empire on earth to the edge of quitting Britain forever, and how close she actually came to winning. Picture this moment, a narrow gap between 2 hills, somewhere in the middle of Britain. On one side, a queen in a chariot, her daughters beside her, facing down a Roman army that thinks it's already lost. On the other side, 10,000 Roman soldiers who haven't slept properly in days, standing dead still, waiting for a signal. Neither side knows yet which one of them is about to disappear from history. We'll get back to that hillside. But first, you need to know how a British queen ended up standing there at all, because it starts with a promise the Romans made and broke. The year is around 60 AD. Rome doesn't just rule the Mediterranean anymore. Its empire stretches from the coast of Wales all the way to Syria, thousands of miles east. Britain has been a Roman province for 17 years, ever since Emperor Claudius invaded in 43 AD. But ruling Britain didn't always mean conquering it village by village. In the east of the island, in the region we now call Norfolk and Suffolk, Rome had made a deal instead. A tribe called the Iceni had agreed to become what historians call a client kingdom. Their own king kept his throne, kept his warriors, kept his lands, as long as he stayed loyal to Rome. That king was Prasutagus. His queen was Boudica. Her name, most historians believe, came from the old Brittonic word for victory, which means the woman remembered today by a nickname meaning victorious is also the same woman who came closer than almost anyone in history to actually driving Rome out of Britain for good. This isn't a legend. It's not a fairy tale dressed up as history. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from 2 Roman writers, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, and from something even more convincing, burnt soil, buried treasure, and shattered pottery that archaeologists are still digging out of the ground in Colchester and London today. The story survived because Rome wrote it down to explain how they'd nearly lost everything. What follows is what happens when an empire breaks its word to the wrong woman. Here's something most people get completely wrong about Iron Age Britain. They picture cavemen. What actually existed was a sophisticated, wealthy, technologically advanced society that simply organized itself differently than Rome did. Iceni villages were built around round wooden houses with cone-shaped, thatched roofs, smoke drifting up through a hole at the top, a fire pit in the center, and walls made of woven hazel branches packed with mud and straw, a building technique called wattle and daub. These weren't primitive huts. Some roundhouses discovered by archaeologists measured over 15 meters across, bigger than plenty of modern living rooms, with room inside for extended families, animals in bad weather, and stores of grain. Celtic Britain had paved roads and organized trackways before the Romans arrived, a fact the Romans conveniently forgot to mention when they later took credit for civilizing the island. Celtic smiths had also already invented chainmail armor, a technology so effective that Roman soldiers eventually copied it wholesale into their own equipment. The idea that Rome brought civilization to a land of savages was in large part Roman marketing. Iron was everywhere in this world, not just in weapons, but in currency. Long, flat iron bars, sometimes shaped almost like a sword blank, were traded as a kind of proto-money across pre-Roman Britain. Gold mattered too, especially in the form of torques, thick, twisted neck rings worn by both men and women, some so finely crafted that museums today display them as masterworks of ancient metalwork rather than mere jewelry. British warriors of this era fought from war chariots, something most of continental Europe had abandoned centuries earlier as outdated. A driver would race a warrior across the battlefield at speed, hurling javelins from the moving platform, then pull up so the warrior could leap down and fight on foot with sword or spear. If the fight turned against him, the chariot would swing back around and pull him out. Julius Caesar, writing about his own brief invasion a century before Boudica's time, described this tactic with genuine astonishment. Roman armies simply didn't fight this way anymore, and it unsettled his soldiers to face it. Close your eyes and picture an Iceni village around 50 AD. Morning. Wood smoke curling from a dozen rooftops, the smell of wet wool and turned earth. Somewhere nearby, a smith is hammering an iron blade, the ringing sound carrying across the whole settlement. Children practice with wooden training spears in the mud, boys and girls both, because in this culture, everyone might one day need to defend the herd, the harvest, or the home. An old woman spins wool by a doorway, watching a young warrior polish a shield rim until it catches the weak morning light. This is the world Boudica ruled. Not a marble palace, but a kingdom built on cattle, grain, iron, and loyalty passed down through generations of families who had lived on this land long before anyone in Rome had ever heard the word Britain. Religion in this world revolved around the Druids, a learned class of priests, judges, teachers, and advisors who held enormous influence across the British tribes. Druids weren't attached to any one kingdom. They moved between tribes, settling disputes, preserving oral history and law, and performing religious rites tied to sacred groves, rivers, and springs. Rome found the Druids deeply unsettling, not just for religious reasons, but political ones. A network of respected leaders who could unite rival tribes against a common enemy was exactly the kind of threat an occupying empire wanted gone. Roman law barely allowed women to own property in their own name. Celtic law was strikingly different. Women in Britain could inherit land, lead households, and, according to Roman writers who found this both fascinating and faintly alarming, sometimes lead warriors into battle. The Roman historian Tacitus later wrote, with something close to disbelief, that in Britain no distinction was made between men and women when it came to who was fit to command. Boudica wasn't an exception to her culture's rules. She was, in many ways, exactly what her culture expected a queen to be capable of becoming. This was the Britain Rome set out to conquer in 43 AD. It didn't go quietly. When Emperor Claudius's legions landed in 43 AD, they came prepared for exactly the kind of resistance this world could offer. Roman legionaries were professional, salaried soldiers, a career, not a temporary levy of farmers grabbing spears for one battle. They trained constantly, fought in tight, disciplined formations, and carried standardized equipment: an iron helmet, a curved rectangular shield, a short stabbing sword called a gladius, and heavy javelins designed to punch through enemy shields on impact. Against that kind of machine, British tribes fighting as individual warbands, however brave, struggled badly. The Catuvalauni, the most powerful tribe in southeastern Britain at the time, led the resistance under two brothers, Togodumnus and Prasutagus. They lost battle after battle. Togodumnus was killed, Prasutagus fled west, kept fighting for years from Wales, and eventually became such a legendary thorn in Rome's side that when he was finally captured and paraded through Rome in chains, he reportedly impressed Emperor Claudius so much with his defiant speech that his life was spared. Rome's approach to conquest wasn't purely military, though. It was also, quite deliberately, financial and political. Rather than fighting every single tribe to total destruction, Roman generals offered certain kings a deal. Keep your throne, keep collecting your own taxes, keep your own laws for local matters, and in exchange, stay loyal, stay disarmed of any real independent army, and accept that you now answer to Rome. These arrangements were called client kingdoms, and they let Rome control an enormous amount of territory without having to permanently station soldiers everywhere at once. Client kings weren't just handed a deal and left alone. Rome often gave them substantial cash gifts and loans as a kind of goodwill payment, partly to buy loyalty and partly to bind them financially to the empire. It looked generous. It was actually a leash. And as we'll see, when Rome eventually decided to call those debts in all at once, it helped light the exact fire this video is about. One of the tribes that chose the client kingdom path almost from the start was the Iceni. Their first king under this new arrangement, not Boudica's husband yet, but an earlier ruler, kept the peace for a while. But that peace turned out to be far more fragile than anyone in Rome expected, because just 4 years after the conquest began, the Iceni already tried to fight back once. In 47 AD, a new Roman governor named Publius Ostorius Scapula arrived in Britain with orders to tighten Rome's grip. One of his first moves was a policy that sounds almost mild on paper and was, in practice, a massive insult. He ordered every British tribe living within reach of Roman territory, allies included, to hand over their weapons. To the Iceni, this was outrageous. They weren't a conquered enemy. They were, on paper, a free and friendly ally of Rome. Disarming them like a defeated people, rather than treating them like partners, was a humiliation their pride couldn't absorb. So they rose up. The Iceni gathered allies from neighboring tribes who shared their anger, fortified a defensive position, likely an earthwork enclosure surrounded by a bank and ditch, a common Iron Age defense, and prepared to resist. Ostorius Scapula didn't wait for the revolt to grow. He marched his own auxiliary troops straight at the Iceni position and stormed it before the uprising could spread any further. The rebellion was crushed in what was, by Roman standards, a relatively minor skirmish, a footnote in the wider story of Roman conquest. Some historians believe this failed revolt is exactly why Prasutagus later became king of the Iceni at all. The theory goes like this. After crushing the 47 AD uprising, Rome may have specifically installed a new, carefully chosen, cooperative king, someone they believed they could trust to keep the Iceni permanently peaceful. If that's true, then the ultimate irony of this entire story is almost too perfect to invent. Rome may have handpicked Prasutagus specifically to prevent another Iceni rebellion, and his own household ended up leading the largest one Roman Britain ever faced. We can't prove that theory with certainty. The ancient sources don't spell out exactly how or when Prasutagus took the throne. But what we do know for certain is this. By the time Boudica became his queen, the Iceni had already tasted defeat at Roman hands once before, and had already learned the hard way exactly how far Rome was willing to go to keep them obedient. Peace held for over a decade after that, and into that fragile peace, Boudica stepped forward as queen. We don't know exactly when Boudica married Prasutagus. We don't know her family background, her age at marriage, or anything about her life before she appears in the historical record as his wife and queen. What we do know comes almost entirely from a single physical description, written decades after her death by a Roman historian named Cassius Dio, who never met her and was likely working from earlier accounts, exaggeration and imagination in equal measure. Dio described her as unusually tall for a woman of her era, with a harsh, powerful voice, and a heavy mass of reddish hair that fell loose past her hips. He said she wore a twisted gold torque around her neck, a brightly colored, patterned tunic, and a thick cloak fastened at the shoulder with a brooch. Whether that's an accurate portrait or a dramatic Roman sketch of what a barbarian queen was supposed to look like, historians genuinely can't say. It's the only physical description that survives, so it's the one that's followed her through nearly 2,000 years of retellings, paintings, and statues. Her name almost certainly wasn't a personal name in the way we'd think of one today. It's closer to a royal title. It comes from an old Celtic word, root meaning victory. In other words, calling her Boudica may have functioned a bit like calling someone Victoria, which, centuries later, would become the name of the very British queen whose era turned Boudica into a national icon. We'll come back to that strange coincidence later. As queen of the Iceni, Boudica wasn't a decorative figure standing quietly beside her husband's throne. Celtic queens of this era were expected to be capable of defending their households, their herds, and their people directly, the same as any warrior, a role Rome's own writers found strange enough to comment on repeatedly. She would have overseen household affairs, managed relationships with allied families and neighboring tribes, and, if Iceni custom matched what we know of Celtic culture more broadly, trained in weapons and horsemanship right alongside the men of her court. She and Prasutagus had 2 daughters. Their names were never recorded by any surviving ancient source, a detail worth remembering because some later dramatizations invent names for them. Real history simply doesn't know. What we do know is that Prasutagus, over the course of a long and stable reign as Rome's ally, built up what Tacitus specifically calls considerable wealth. The Iceni kingdom, under this careful cooperative king, prospered. For years, this was Boudica's entire world, a queen, a wife, a mother, ruling alongside a husband who had made peace with the empire work, at least on the surface, for almost 2 decades. Then Prasutagus got sick, and everything Boudica had spent her adult life protecting started to come apart at once. Around 60 AD, King Prasutagus died, and in his final act as king, he tried something clever, a legal maneuver meant to protect both his family and his kingdom after he was gone. In his will, Prasutagus left half of everything, his lands, his fortune, his entire kingdom, directly to the Roman Emperor Nero. The other half he left to his 2 daughters. It wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A king with no living son had to find some way to convince Rome that the Iceni still deserved to be treated as partners, not prey, even with no male heir to inherit the throne in the traditional way. Giving Nero half of everything was Prasutagus' way of saying, I'm not challenging you, I'm inviting you in on my own terms, so my daughters can keep the rest. It failed completely, almost immediately. Roman administrators looked at a kingdom with no king and no adult male heir and saw something very different from a partnership offer. They saw an opportunity. Under Roman legal thinking, when a client king died without a recognized male successor, his entire kingdom could simply be absorbed, annexed outright into the province, with no obligation to honor whatever the dead king had written down. This wasn't even close to the first time Rome had done this to a conquered or allied territory. Absorbing friendly kingdoms the moment their rulers died without a male heir was practically a standard Roman playbook across the empire. Prasutagus' will wasn't naive, it was a reasonable gamble based on how careful, cooperative client kings were sometimes treated elsewhere. It just happened to fail spectacularly in his specific case, at exactly the wrong political moment. Roman soldiers moved into Iceni territory almost immediately. Tacitus records that the king's own household was looted as if it were the spoils of war, plunder taken from a defeated enemy, not property inherited under a legal will from a loyal ally. Roman centurions seized land. The most respected noble families of the Iceni, people who had held their positions for generations, were stripped of everything, some of them reportedly enslaved outright, treated exactly like the population of a freshly conquered enemy, rather than the citizens of a long-time Roman partner. Half a kingdom, promised in good faith to the Roman emperor himself, wasn't enough. Rome wanted and took everything. And underneath all of this, there was another pressure building, one that had nothing to do with wills or inheritance law at all. Here's something Tacitus barely mentions, but Cassius Dio, writing later, puts front and center: money. Years before Prasutagus' death, back when Emperor Claudius first secured British loyalty after the 43 AD conquest, Rome had handed out large cash gifts to friendly British rulers. Payments meant to buy goodwill and keep client kings feeling generously treated rather than resentfully occupied. Dio also claims that a wealthy Roman figure, possibly even Seneca, the famous philosopher, playwright, and one of the richest men in the entire empire, who also happened to be one of Emperor Nero's closest advisors, had lent enormous additional sums of money to British nobles. Now, with Prasutagus dead and Rome tightening its grip across the province, those loans were suddenly being called in, all at once, with interest, from people who almost certainly didn't have anywhere near enough ready cash to pay. To understand why this hit so hard, it helps to understand who was actually running day-to-day Roman administration in Britain at this exact moment. Roman provinces typically had 2 separate lines of power: a military governor, focused on defense and conquest, and a financial officer called a procurator, focused on taxes, revenue, and the treasury. In 60 AD, the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was busy leading a military campaign clear across the country in Wales. That left the man actually running financial policy in the east, a procurator named Catus Decianus, with essentially no military check on his decisions at all. Catus Decianus would go down in Roman history as one of the most catastrophically incompetent officials of his era, not because he was uniquely cruel by Roman standards, but because his greed and impatience, at the exact wrong moment, with no governor present to rein him in, turned a tense but manageable political crisis into an empire-threatening war. Whichever cause mattered more, the seized inheritance Tacitus emphasizes, or the called-in debts Dio focuses on, the Iceni were being squeezed from every direction at once, at the exact moment they had lost the one king who had spent 2 decades keeping the peace. And then Boudica did the one thing a grieving, furious queen was expected to do. She objected. This is the hardest part of the story to tell, and I'm going to tell it carefully because it's true, and because it's the reason everything that follows actually happened. When Boudica stood up as queen and challenged what Rome's officials were doing to her family, her household, and her people, Roman officials had her whipped in public. and her 2 daughters, still teenagers, were attacked and badly harmed by Roman soldiers in a way so cruel that even Tacitus, a Roman writer with no particular sympathy for Britain's tribes, called it a disgrace, something beneath what Rome itself was supposed to stand for. Sit with what that moment actually was for a second. Not a battle, not soldiers fighting soldiers, a ruling queen, someone owed formal respect even under Rome's own diplomatic customs, publicly humiliated in front of her own people by the exact empire her husband had spent his entire reign trying to stay on good terms with. Her daughters, harmed in a way that should never have happened to anyone, let alone the children of a king who had died a loyal Roman ally. This is the moment we opened this video standing on the other side of. This what put Boudica in that chariot, in that valley, months later. This entire event, arguably the single most important cause of the whole revolt, comes down to us from exactly one ancient writer in a single dense paragraph. Cassius Dio, writing his own account later, doesn't mention the flogging or the assault on her daughters at all. For him, the uprising is purely about broken loans and Roman financial greed. Historians generally trust Tacitus's version more, partly because his own father-in-law, a Roman officer named Agricola, served in Britain around this exact period and may have been one of Tacitus's direct sources. But it's genuinely worth pausing on this. Almost the entire emotional foundation of one of history's most famous revolts rests on a handful of sentences, written by a man who wasn't even alive when it happened. What we do know is what happened next. Word of what had been done to Boudica and her daughters spread through eastern Britain fast, and it landed on ground that was already dry as kindling, waiting for exactly this kind of spark. The Iceni weren't the only tribe with grievances against Rome. Just to their south lived the Trinovantes, an older, once dominant tribe whose ancestral capital, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, had been turned into something they could barely recognize. After conquering the region, Rome built a massive colony there specifically for retired legionary soldiers, men given land as a reward for finishing their military service. Trinovantian families were reportedly thrown out of their own homes to make room, their farmland handed over outright to Roman veterans. On top of that, Rome had built an enormous temple in the city dedicated to the worship of the former Emperor Claudius, now honored as a god. British nobles were required to serve as priests of that temple, an honor on paper, but one that came with crushing financial obligations, since funding the temple's rituals, festivals, and sacrifices out of your own pocket was part of the job. Some historians believe that temples' upkeep costs were so enormous that they quietly bankrupted much of the local Trinovantian elite over time. Rome had literally built a monument to its own conquest, right in the middle of a defeated people's former capital, and then sent that same people the bill for keeping it running. So when word spread that Boudica was calling for revolt, she wasn't lighting a match in an empty field. She was throwing a torch into a room that was already full of gas fumes. The Trinovantes joined almost immediately. Word moved outward from there. Other tribes across eastern Britain, carrying their own resentments about land, taxes, and broken promises, began falling in behind her banner. And the timing could not have been worse for Rome. The governor of the entire province, a hardened career general named Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was on the complete opposite side of the country, leading nearly every soldier he had available on a very different mission entirely: the total destruction of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales, the last major stronghold of the Druids in Britain. This is our first return to the open loop. Remember that valley we opened this video standing in? We're a long way from it yet, because at the exact moment Boudica's rebellion was catching fire in the east, Rome's best army in Britain was 300 miles away, burning down something else entirely. Chapter 9. The Druids' Last Stand at Mona. Mona wasn't just another British stronghold to Rome, it was a symbol. As the spiritual and educational center of Druidic Britain, it represented exactly the kind of unifying, cross-tribal authority that made Roman governors nervous. As long as Mona stood, Rome believed rebellious tribes across the island would always have somewhere to turn for religious backing and moral authority against the empire. Picture standing on the deck of a Roman assault boat crossing the narrow strait toward Mona's shore. Ahead of you, the beach isn't empty. Lines of Druid priests stand at the water's edge, arms raised toward the sky, chanting curses down on the approaching soldiers. Running between them, according to Tacitus, are women dressed entirely in black, hair wild and loose, moving through the ranks like something out of a nightmare, torches held high. For one long moment, Roman soldiers, battle-hardened men who had fought across half the known world, simply freeze on their boats, too unsettled to move. It takes their own officers physically shouting and shoving to get the advance started again. Rome won, of course. It usually did. The Druid resistance on the beach was overwhelmed, the sacred groves behind them, ancient sites of ritual and religious memory, were cut down and burned, and Mona's status as Britain's spiritual heart was effectively destroyed in a single brutal campaign. This entire dramatic beach scene comes from Tacitus, and it's one of the most vivid single passages in his whole account of Roman Britain. Historians still debate how much of it is accurate reporting and how much is Tacitus writing a gripping scene for dramatic effect. Either way, it tells us something true about how unsettling Rome found organized British resistance, especially resistance wrapped in religious authority it didn't fully understand. But here's the problem for Rome. While Suetonius Paulinus was securing this symbolic victory on one edge of the map, an actual military catastrophe was building on the opposite edge entirely. A queen with a very real, very large, very furious army was already moving, and almost nothing stood between her and the heart of Roman Britain. Camulodunum had no real defensive walls. As Rome's first capital in Britain, it had always been treated as a symbol of secure victory rather than a frontier fortress, and nobody had seriously planned for it to need defending. When terrified residents realized a massive British force was approaching, they sent an urgent request for reinforcements to the nearest Roman outpost, and received exactly 200 lightly armed men in response. It was nowhere near enough. Boudica's army swept into the city and overran it almost completely within days. The last defenders barricaded themselves inside the great temple of Claudius, the same building whose upkeep had helped bankrupt local nobles, and held out under siege for 2 full days before finally being overwhelmed. What happened next was brutal, and the ancient sources don't soften it. The city was burned to the ground. Its people, anyone who hadn't managed to flee in time, were killed. Picture being a child in Camulodunum on that final morning. You've heard the rumors for days. A British army, bigger than anyone can remember, burning everything in its path toward your city. Now you can hear it before you can see it. A low roar of thousands of voices, war horns echoing off the hills. Your mother grabs your hand and pulls you toward the temple, where half the city is already crowded inside the thick stone walls, believing, hoping that Rome's most sacred building in Britain will somehow be the one place they're safe. It isn't. This isn't just something Roman writers claimed happened. It's something you can still see with your own eyes, underground, right now, in modern Colchester. Among the ruins at Colchester, archaeologists have also found fragments of a shattered bronze statue, almost certainly a monument to Emperor Nero himself, torn down and smashed apart during the sack of the city. Boudica's forces didn't just burn buildings, they went after the literal physical image of the man who ruled the empire that had humiliated her, and tore it apart piece by piece. But the very worst news for Rome hadn't even happened yet. A Roman commander named Quintus Petilius Cerealis, leading roughly 2,000 experienced soldiers from the 9th Legion, marched to relieve Camulodunum the moment word of the attack reached him. He never got the chance to save it. Boudica's forces ambushed the legion's infantry column on the road and effectively destroyed it. Cerealis himself barely escaped with his cavalry, riding hard for the nearest fortified position, while behind him, one of the most experienced fighting units in the entire Roman army simply ceased to exist as an effective force. One of only 4 legions defending Roman Britain, gutted in a single afternoon. The first Roman city was Ash. A Roman legion lay in ruins, and Boudica's army, swelling now with warriors from tribe after tribe rushing to join her, turned south toward a fast-growing trading settlement on the river Thames that Rome hadn't even bothered to build walls around. Its name was Londinium. By the time Suetonius Paulinus learned what was happening back east, he'd already burned Mona to the ground. Now he force-marched south with everything he could move quickly. likely just his cavalry and a small advance guard, racing far ahead of his main infantry, straight toward Londinium. He got there first, and when he looked at what he actually had to work with, he made one of the coldest, most calculated decisions of the entire war. Londinium wasn't a fortress. It was barely a decade old, a booming, unwalled trading hub packed with wooden buildings, busy docks, and merchants from across the empire, but almost no soldiers stationed to defend it. Suetonius did the math immediately. He simply didn't have enough men to hold the city. If he tried and lost, Roman Britain itself might collapse in a single catastrophic battle. So he made his choice. He abandoned the city outright. Tacitus records the decision in blunt military language. Suetonius sacrificed one town in order to save the entire province. He ordered everyone capable of traveling to leave with him immediately, and marched his small force back out, north up the old Roman road, buying time to gather his real army. Not everyone could go. The elderly, the sick, and anyone who stayed behind hoping Rome would somehow return in time were left in the city when Boudica's army finally arrived. The ancient sources don't linger on exactly what happened to them in loving detail, but the archaeology underneath modern London tells the rest of the story on its own, silently, layer by layer. Beneath the city of London today, under office towers, under tube tunnels, under some of the most expensive real estate on Earth, archaeologists keep finding it, a thick band of reddish-brown ash, sometimes over half a meter deep in places, made of scorched clay, melted glass, and burnt pottery. It's the exact same destruction horizon found at Colchester, marking the spot where Roman Londinium simply stopped existing for a while. Picture living in Londinium in those final hours. You've watched the Roman governor and his soldiers march out of the city gates, leaving you behind with nothing but rumors and a rising sense of dread. The streets that were bustling with merchants a week ago are half empty now, doors boarded shut, carts abandoned mid-load. In the distance, you can already smell smoke on the wind, Camulodunum smoke, weeks old, or is it something closer now? You have a small clay pot in your hands, filled with a handful of carved gemstones, jewelry you'd been saving, meant for rings you hadn't finished making yet. There's no time left to sell them, no time to run far enough. You dig a small hole near a wall and bury the pot, telling yourself you'll come back for it once this is over. That pot is real. Archaeologists found it near what's now Eastcheap in the city of London, buried in the exact burnt layer we've been describing. 4 carved gemstones meant for rings, hidden in a panic by someone who never came back for them. 2,000 years later, it's still there, a tiny, silent piece of the very last hours of somebody's ordinary life. Archaeologists digging near Fenchurch Street also found something else preserved in that same burnt layer. Scorched grain, including a type of wheat that doesn't even grow naturally in Britain. Grain imported from the Mediterranean, mixed with seeds from weeds that only grow in warmer climates. That detail tells historians something important about the mood of the province right before the revolt. Britain had likely suffered a poor harvest that year, bad enough that Londinium was importing emergency grain from overseas just to get by. A hungry, financially squeezed population makes a far easier crowd to convince to pick up a spear and march. Londinium burned. Historians estimate the combined death toll across the 2 ruined cities may already have reached tens of thousands. And Boudica's army, now genuinely massive, swollen with fighters from across eastern Britain, marched on toward a third target entirely, Verulamium, modern St. Albans, a wealthy town whose British residents had chosen cooperation with Rome over resistance. Verulamium was different from the other 2 targets in one important way. It wasn't full of Roman veterans, Roman officials, or Roman temples. It was mostly British people, Britons who had adopted Roman customs, Roman buildings, and Roman loyalty as their own path forward. To Boudica's army, sweeping through the countryside on a wave of fury and momentum, that made them collaborators rather than neutral bystanders. Unlike Londinium, most of Verulamium's residents had at least some warning of what was coming, and managed to flee with whatever belongings they could carry. Suetonius focused entirely on saving the wider province rather than one more individual town, made no attempt to defend it either. Boudica's forces arrived, looted what remained, and burned it to the ground, leaving behind the exact same telltale layer of scorched red earth that archaeologists still find at the site today. By the time the third fire had finally burned out, the ancient sources put the combined death toll across all three cities at somewhere around 70 to 80,000 people. Most historians today believe that specific number is likely exaggerated. Roman writers loved big, dramatic figures, and battle statistics from the ancient world were rarely precise counts, but even a fraction of that total would make this one of the deadliest single uprisings in the entire history of Roman Britain. The destruction may not have stopped at just the three cities the ancient writers actually named. In the 1930s, an archaeologist named Gerald Dunning noticed something strange about early Roman pottery found around what's now London Bridge. Finished goods, ready for sale, were consistently damaged by fire in a way that shouldn't happen to items sitting safely in a shop, almost as if entire warehouses had burned down around them. Much more recently, digs at Silchester, a British town southwest of London that Tacitus never even mentions by name, have turned up the exact same burnt destruction layer, dated to the exact same period. It suggests Boudica's revolt reached further and burned deeper than the two surviving Roman historians ever bothered to record. 3 cities in ashes, tens of thousands dead, a Roman legion effectively destroyed, and still Suetonius Paulinus had not lost. He'd spent the entire revolt so far doing something that looked on the surface exactly like retreat, refusing open battle, giving up city after city without a fight, marching his small force steadily north instead of standing his ground anywhere. But every single mile he pulled back, he was buying time. Time for the rest of his infantry to finish their long march down from Wales. Time to gather every soldier he could reasonably scrape together. And time to choose, deliberately and carefully, exactly where the final confrontation would happen. We're getting very close to that valley now. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand exactly what a Roman legion actually was. A full legion contained roughly 5,000 men, organized into smaller units called centuries and cohorts, each with its own officers, all trained to move, fight, and hold formation as a single coordinated machine rather than a loose crowd of individual fighters. Legionaries fought shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, javelins thrown in disciplined volleys before the front ranks closed in with short stabbing swords. Alongside the legions marched auxiliary troops, cavalry and additional infantry, often recruited from other conquered peoples across the empire, filling in gaps in skills the legions themselves lacked, like extra cavalry or specialized archers. By 60 AD, Roman Britain had 4 legions stationed across the province, roughly 20,000 legionaries total, backed by a roughly equal number of auxiliary troops, somewhere near 40,000 soldiers altogether, spread thin across a territory stretching from the south coast up through the Midlands and into the borders of Wales. One of those legions, the 9th, had already been gutted trying to relieve Camulodunum. Suetonius gathered what remained of his available forces. The 14th Legion, nicknamed Gemina Martia Victrix, plus detachments from the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, along with whatever auxiliary cohorts and cavalry he could reasonably pull together on short notice. All told, historians estimate his final army numbered somewhere around 10,000 men. He'd sent urgent orders to a 4th Legion, the 2nd Augusta, stationed in the southwest, to march immediately and join him. It never came. The acting commander in charge of that legion, a man named Puinius Postumus, simply didn't move, whether out of caution, confusion, or fear of what he'd be marching into. No ancient source explains for certain. We'll come back to what that decision cost him. With roughly 10,000 men against a British force that outnumbered him by 10 to 1 or more, Suetonius couldn't win a straightforward fight in open ground. So he didn't look for open ground. He searched instead for terrain that could turn his weakness, being badly outnumbered, into a strength. He found it, a narrow valley shaped like a funnel, with thick woodland at his back to block any surprise attack from behind, and a tight, defile-like approach in front that would force any attacking army to bunch up into a crushing, disorganized crowd instead of spreading out wide enough to surround him. Tacitus actually preserves a detailed description of exactly how Suetonius chose this ground: a narrow approach, secure flanks, open plain ahead with no cover for an ambush. It's rare for an ancient historian to give this much tactical detail about a specific battlefield, which is part of why historians take the account of the battle itself fairly seriously, even while doubting the exact casualty numbers that come afterward. He had perhaps 10,000 men. Boudica had, by even conservative modern estimates, at minimum 80 to 100,000, and possibly far more. We're back on the hilltop. This is it. This is the moment we opened the entire video standing inside. Tacitus tells us that before the fighting began, Boudica rode along the front of her own lines in her chariot, her 2 daughters beside her, and spoke to her assembled army. Tacitus even records what she supposedly said, a furious speech about Roman greed, about a woman's right to fight for her home and her family's honor, about winning everything or losing everything, rather than living another day as Rome's property. Most historians think Tacitus invented the exact wording himself. Putting dramatic speeches into historical figures' mouths was simply how Roman history writing worked at the time, and there's no realistic way a Roman writer, working decades later, actually knew Boudica's precise words, spoken in her own language, on a battlefield he never witnessed. But the core sentiment Tacitus assigns her, that she had come to win completely or die trying, almost certainly reflects what people at the time genuinely believed she stood for. Picture standing in the front rank of that enormous British army. The ground beneath your feet is cold, packed dirt, still damp from the morning. Behind you, stretching back farther than you can see, sit the wagons, your family's wagons, loaded with your grandmother, your younger brother, and nearly everything your household owns, parked in a giant curve because everyone was so certain of victory that they'd come to watch it happen. In front of you, a solid wall of Roman shields, disciplined still, unnervingly quiet. Your heart is slamming against your ribs. Somewhere down the line, a war horn sounds, long and low, and the entire army, tens of thousands of people at once, surges forward at a dead run. Suetonius had positioned his legionaries in tight formation, funneled deliberately into that narrow defile, exactly as he'd planned for. As the massive British charge closed the gap, Roman soldiers unleashed volleys of heavy iron javelins called pyla, weapons designed specifically to punch through shields and bend on impact, so they couldn't easily be pulled out and thrown back. At close range, the charge that had looked completely unstoppable a moment earlier crashed instead into a wall of professional, heavily armored soldiers fighting in tight, coordinated wedges, each man protected by the shield of the soldier beside him. The open field Boudica's army had counted on to make full use of their overwhelming numbers never actually materialized. The narrow terrain packed them together so tightly that most warriors could barely swing a weapon without hitting their own side. Roman cavalry swept in hard from both flanks. And then came the detail that turned this from a defeat into an outright catastrophe. As British warriors began to break and retreat, they ran straight into that same ring of wagons their own families had parked to watch what they'd believed would be a triumphant victory. There was simply nowhere left to go. Tacitus records that Roman soldiers killed almost everyone in their path that day. Not only armed warriors, but the women and pack animals trapped inside the wagon circle as well. He places the final numbers at roughly 80,000 Britons dead, against only 400 Roman losses. Nearly every historian today believes those specific numbers are wildly one-sided. Essentially ancient propaganda. Battle reports sent home to Rome functioned a lot like modern press releases, written by the winning general to make himself look as good as possible. But even scaling those figures down dramatically, there's no real historical debate about the overall outcome. It was a total, crushing, one-sided Roman victory. One more grim footnote to the day. Hoenius Posthumus, the officer whose second legion had never arrived to help, learned afterward exactly what his fellow Roman soldiers had accomplished without him. Consumed by shame at having missed the battle entirely, he took his own life with his own sword. Despite everything historians know about how this battle unfolded, the tactics, the wagons, the javelin volleys, nobody actually knows exactly where it happened. Neither Tacitus nor Cassius Dio names the location. For decades, most historians guessed somewhere near Manchester in Warwickshire, along the old Roman road that gives the battle its modern name, Watling Street. More recently, some researchers have argued instead for a site called Church Stowe in Northamptonshire, pointing to matching terrain and possible traces of Roman fortifications spotted from aerial surveys. As of right now, nobody has found the one piece of physical proof that would settle the question for good. A mass grave, a field scattered with Roman military equipment, anything that physically ties a real hillside to this exact battle. Somewhere in the English countryside, the true site of one of the most important battles in British history is still out there, waiting to be found. The revolt was over, and very shortly so was Boudica. Here, the two ancient sources split completely, and neither one can be confirmed. Tacitus writes that Boudica, facing total defeat, and knowing exactly what fate Rome had in store for her if captured alive, ended her own life by poison rather than be dragged through the streets of Rome in chains as a conquered enemy on display. Cassius Dio tells it differently. He writes that Boudica fell ill sometime after the battle, from wounds, exhaustion, or grief, he never specifies which, and died from that illness. He adds one more detail Tacitus leaves out entirely, that her own people gave her an extravagant funeral, a final act of loyalty from a population that had followed her all the way to the edge of pushing an empire out of Britain. We will likely never know for certain which version is true. Both writers agree on the one fact that actually matters most. Boudica did not survive to become Rome's prisoner. However her story ended, it ended on her own terms, not Rome's. Her daughters, the two girls whose suffering had helped ignite the entire revolt in the first place, simply vanish from the historical record at this exact point. No ancient writer tells us what happened to them. We don't know if they died at Watling Street beside their mother, escaped and went into hiding, or lived out quiet, completely unrecorded lives somewhere in the ruins of their family's kingdom. It's one of the most frustrating silences in this entire story. Two real people, absolutely central to everything that happened, whom history simply stopped writing about the moment the fighting ended. You might expect that after crushing the revolt, Rome would ease up on Britain out of relief. It did the opposite, at first. Suetonius Paulinus, now the celebrated hero of the entire war, spent months afterward hunting down and punishing any tribe suspected of having joined the rebellion, burning villages and seizing land with a level of brutality that alarmed even his own government back in Rome. A new financial official sent to investigate the province, a man named Julius Classicianus, was so disturbed by what he found that he wrote directly to Emperor Nero, warning that Suetonius' ongoing revenge campaign was making the long-term situation worse, not better, turning a defeated enemy population into a permanently, dangerously resentful one. Nero actually listened. He recalled Suetonius Paulinus back to Rome and replaced him with governors under new instructions to calm the province down rather than punish it further. It's a small, easily overlooked detail buried in the aftermath of this whole story, but it's genuinely remarkable. A Roman emperor, alarmed by a single provincial official's warning, chose careful diplomacy over continued bloodshed in the immediate aftermath of the deadliest revolt Britain ever threw at Rome. Even Silchester, the British town, whose burnt destruction layer archaeologists only connected to the revolt fairly recently, shows physical signs of this new, more cautious Roman approach. When the town was eventually rebuilt, its streets were laid out at a completely different alignment than before, no longer following older Celtic seasonal and solar traditions, but a fresh Roman grid instead. It's a small physical signal, still visible in the archaeology today, of a culture being quietly, permanently reshaped in the revolt's aftermath. Roman Britain survived. It would remain a Roman province for another 3.5 centuries after this, all the way until 410 AD. But it never quite forgot how close it had come to falling apart in a single terrible year. For well over 1,000 years after her death, almost nobody in Britain knew Boudica's name at all. The Tacitus manuscript that recorded her story most fully was essentially lost to Western Europe for centuries, rediscovered by scholars only around the 1300s, and not widely read in England until the 1500s. Boudica wasn't a permanent national legend passed down generation to generation the way you might assume. She was genuinely forgotten, completely, and then rediscovered almost by accident, buried inside an old Roman manuscript that had survived by pure luck. For a long stretch of that same history, even her name was recorded incorrectly. A medieval copying error transformed Boudica into Boadicea in some manuscripts, and that mistaken spelling stuck around stubbornly in English books and school lessons for centuries afterward, sitting right alongside the correct version, confusing readers well into modern times. Once English scholars rediscovered Tacitus' account, though, Boudica's story found an entirely new audience and an entirely new purpose. Tudor and Victorian writers, discovering a fierce, defiant British queen who had stood up to a foreign invading empire, reshaped her into a national symbol almost immediately. In 1782, the poet William Cowper wrote a widely celebrated poem imagining her as a prophetic figure, predicting that Britain would one day rise to become a greater empire than Rome itself ever was. It became enormously popular, quoted and referenced for generations, and helped cement Boudica's image in the British public imagination as something closer to a legendary founding hero than a defeated rebel queen. It didn't hurt her popularity that, by the 1800s, England had its own queen sitting on the throne, Queen Victoria, whose very name comes from the exact same root word, victory, that likely gave Boudica her name in the first place. Victorian Britain leaned into that coincidence hard, treating Boudica almost as a spiritual ancestor to their own reigning monarch. The famous statue of Boudica in her chariot, standing today right beside the Houses of Parliament on the Victoria Embankment in London, spears mounted menacingly on the wheels, her two daughters riding beside her, wasn't built anywhere near her actual lifetime. It was designed by a sculptor named Thomas Thornycroft, encouraged directly by Prince Albert himself, starting in the 1850s, and wasn't actually finished and installed in its current location until 1902, a full year after Queen Victoria had already died. The single most famous image of Boudica that most people have ever seen is, remarkably, younger than the Eiffel Tower. Boudica's story kept getting reused and reshaped across the centuries that followed, in paintings, in plays, in schoolbooks, eventually in films and television. Each era tended to remake her slightly in its own image, a Victorian symbol of imperial destiny, a 20th century symbol of fierce motherhood defending her children, and today, increasingly, a feminist icon representing resistance against abuse of power. None of these later versions is exactly the historical Boudica, because the historical Boudica, outside of one catastrophic year of her life, remains almost entirely unknown to us. What each generation has really been doing, again and again, is finding its own reflection in the handful of dramatic facts two Roman writers happen to preserve. Chapter 19, The Woman Who Refused to Disappear. Today, historians are still actively arguing about her, how large her army really was, where her final battle actually took place, whether Tacitus's dramatic pre-battle speech reflects anything close to her real words, even what she truly looked like. Almost everything about her life outside that one single catastrophic year remains a genuine mystery, and probably always will. And maybe that's precisely why she's still remembered at all, nearly 2,000 years later. Not because we know everything about her, we actually know remarkably little, but because of the one thing we do know for absolute certain. A queen was publicly humiliated by the most powerful empire on earth, and instead of quietly disappearing the way Rome expected, that she came closer than almost anyone else in the entire history of the Roman Empire, to burning that empire's grip on an entire province to the ground. Remember that valley where we started, the moment right before everything was decided? Boudica lost that battle, but she never lost the fight to be remembered. 2,000 years later, we're still saying her name, still standing at her statue by the Thames, still arguing over exactly which hillside holds her last stand, because some people, once they finally refuse to kneel, never really disappear at all.